There are moments when the fabric of destiny shifts beneath one's feet, subtle as morning mist yet profound enough to reshape the course of countless lives. In the harsh territories of the northern reaches, where survival demanded choices that carved souls into shapes that could endure what gentler lands would never comprehend, such moments arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet desperation of decisions that revealed character when all pretense had been stripped away. The Ashwood Pack had thrived for generations through adherence to principles that prioritized collective survival over individual sentiment, practical necessity over emotional impulse. It was wisdom born from countless seasons when mercy had proven fatal, and compassion had invited destruction from enemies who viewed such qualities as exploitable weaknesses rather than admirable virtues. In this world of perpetual testing, strength was measured not by the power to protect, but by the wisdom to sacrifice what was lost for what could still be saved. Lyra Ashen existed at the margins of this unforgiving society, marked from birth by circumstances that made her survival dependent upon the tolerance of those who saw little value in preserving what they perceived as inherent weakness. Born small and late to shift, lacking the aggressive instincts that marked natural leaders, she had learned to navigate pack politics through careful invisibility and strategic usefulness that made her presence bearable to those who possessed real authority. But on the night when winter's grip tightened around the Ashwood territories with brutal intensity that promised death to any who could not maintain the pace of survival, Lyra would face choice that stripped away every comfortable illusion about the price of conscience in a world that rewarded only results. The decision would reveal whether the compassion others scorned as fatal weakness might prove to be strength of a different kind, one that attracted attention from powers that operated according to laws her pack had never understood. The dying cub that would catalyze her transformation represented everything their society had been taught to abandon: vulnerability without utility, need without reciprocal value, life that demanded sacrifice without offering equivalent return. By every measure that governed pack survival, the choice was clear, logical, and necessary. The strong would endure. The weak would be mourned briefly and forgotten permanently. Yet in the space between what wisdom demanded and what conscience whispered, Lyra would discover that some decisions transcended calculation, revealing truths about the nature of strength that challenged every assumption about what it meant to be worthy of survival in a world where worthiness was determined by those who had never faced such choices themselves. The pack would laugh at her defiance, certain that they were witnessing the self-destruction of someone too naive to understand the realities that governed their existence. By sunrise, their laughter would become silence as they confronted evidence that their understanding of power, authority, and the mysterious forces that truly shaped their world was far more limited than they had ever imagined possible. The girl they had dismissed as weak would be claimed by power that made their own authority seem insignificant, forcing them to reconsider their most fundamental beliefs about strength, weakness, and the dangerous territory that existed between survival and honor in a world where both were luxuries few could afford. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The cull was scheduled for the dark hours before dawn, when the pack's collective will would be strong enough to make decisions that daylight might render impossible through unwelcome clarity about what survival demanded from those who claimed to value life while systematically destroying it. Elder Gareth had announced the selection with ceremonial gravity that emphasized duty over sentiment, necessity over preference, wisdom over the emotional indulgence that had destroyed lesser packs who lacked resolve to make choices that preserved strength through elimination of weakness. Lyra stood among the silent gathering as names were read with mechanical precision, each one representing young wolves whose development had failed to meet standards that experience had proven necessary for pack survival during the harsh months that stretched ahead. Winter in the northern reaches claimed lives through cold, hunger, and territorial disputes with neighboring packs, whose own survival depended upon taking what they needed from those too weak to defend their resources effectively. The practical mathematics were undeniable. Food stores would support limited numbers through the lean season. Defensive capabilities could protect only those whose contribution justified the resources required for their survival. Training time invested in wolves who might never achieve adequate strength would be time stolen from those whose potential could be fully realized if properly supported through concentrated effort. "Finn Whiteclaw," Elder Gareth announced, with voice that suggested he took no pleasure in necessity, that nonetheless required fulfillment, regardless of personal feelings. Marked for culling due to persistent failure to demonstrate acceptable progress in essential survival skills. The young wolf in question couldn't have been more than 14 seasons old, his small frame trembling with a combination of cold and terror that made Lyra's chest tighten with unwelcome sympathy. She had watched Finn struggle through training exercises that came naturally to his peers, had seen his desperate efforts to prove himself worthy of continued inclusion in pack activities that would determine his eligibility for adult membership. Sarah Ironback. Marked for culling due to developmental delays that indicate likelihood of permanent disability that would compromise pack defensive capabilities. The second name belonged to adolescent female whose hunting injuries had left her with mobility limitations that would indeed affect her ability to contribute to pack security or territory defense. The logical assessment was accurate, though Lyra found herself remembering the girl's fierce determination to participate in activities that caused obvious pain, but which she refused to abandon despite mounting evidence that improvement was unlikely. Marcus Stormwind. Marked for culling due to aggressive tendencies that cannot be channeled productively and represent potential threat to pack cohesion. The third selection represented different category of weakness, not inability to contribute, but potential to disrupt through unpredictable behavior that had already resulted in conflicts requiring intervention from pack leadership. Marcus had shown flashes of capability mixed with volatility that made his continued presence a calculated risk rather than obvious benefit. As Elder Gareth continued reading names that would be removed from pack rosters before dawn, Lyra found her attention drawn to movement at the edge of the gathering, where families said final farewells to young wolves whose elimination had been deemed necessary for collective survival. The practical cruelty of the process was softened by ceremonial recognition of sacrifice, though such comfort seemed inadequate compensation for lives that would end to preserve resources for those deemed more likely to justify investment. But it was the fourth name that stopped her breath entirely and transformed intellectual understanding of pack necessity into personal crisis that challenged every assumption about what she owed to collective survival versus individual conscience. Kieran Shadowmere. Marked for culling due to chronic illness that has proven resistant to treatment and represents ongoing drain on medical resources required for maintaining pack health standards. The young cub was barely 10 seasons old, his condition the result of birth complications that had left him with respiratory difficulties that indeed required constant attention from healers whose services were limited and desperately needed for treating injuries and illnesses that could be successfully addressed. The practical assessment was logical and defensible, though watching his mother's expression as she processed finality of judgment made Lyra's stomach clench with revulsion. Kieran himself seemed to understand what the announcement meant despite his youth, his wide eyes reflecting acceptance that spoke of conversations with family members who had been preparing him for possibility that his continued survival might not be sustainable given pack priorities and resource limitations. His quiet dignity in face of death sentence imposed by adults whose responsibility was protection rather than elimination revealed strength that had nothing to do with physical capability. The selected individuals will be escorted beyond territorial boundaries at the prescribed time. Elder Gareth continued with administrative precision that emphasized efficiency over emotional consideration. Pack members are reminded that interference with necessary decisions represents challenge to collective survival and will be addressed accordingly. The warning was clear and comprehensive, establishing consequences for anyone whose personal feelings might override practical necessity, as determined by pack leadership, whose responsibility included making choices that individuals might lack courage to support despite recognizing their necessity. As the gathering began dispersing with subdued conversations that reflected acceptance of decisions none could change through protest or appeal, Lyra found herself unable to move away from observation of families completing final interactions with young wolves who would not survive until morning. The combination of resigned acceptance and carefully suppressed grief created atmosphere of tragic necessity that felt suffocating despite the open space surrounding the assembly area. But her paralysis was interrupted by sound that cut through muted conversations with clarity that demanded immediate attention. Kieran Shadowmere had begun coughing with intensity that suggested his condition was deteriorating more rapidly than anticipated, his small frame racked by spasms that seemed to threaten immediate collapse rather than gradual decline over remaining hours before scheduled execution. His mother moved to provide comfort, but her efforts seemed inadequate against crisis that was escalating beyond her ability to address through simple presence or encouragement. Other pack members maintained respectful distance that reflected understanding that medical intervention would be wasteful given impending elimination, though their deliberate avoidance felt like abandonment rather than practical resource management. Lyra watched medical crisis unfold with growing sense of outrage that challenged every assumption about pack values and priorities that she had been taught to accept without question. The dying cub represented everything her society claimed to protect: innocence, potential, hope for future that could be different than harsh present, if enough strength could be preserved to create space for growth rather than survival focused only on immediate necessity. Yet those same values demanded his elimination because his protection would require resources that could be used to strengthen others whose prospects seemed more favorable according to calculations that reduced individual worth to mathematical equations about contribution versus consumption. "Leave him," Elder Gareth said when Kieran's mother looked desperately toward pack leadership for guidance about whether medical intervention was permitted during final hours before execution. The cull proceeds as scheduled. Emotional attachment serves no purpose beyond prolonging suffering that will end regardless. The blunt assessment was accurate, but devastating, reducing mother's love to counterproductive sentiment that interfered with efficient implementation of necessary decisions. But something in the elder's tone suggested that his own conviction was less absolute than his words indicated, as if he too struggled with implications of choices that survival demanded despite their emotional cost. "But he's dying now," Kieran's mother protested with voice that carried desperation rather than defiance. "Surely mercy would permit—" "Mercy," Elder Gareth interrupted with emphasis that made clear such considerations were forbidden luxuries, "is what we show to those who will survive by making decisions that ensure their continued existence. Sentiment that interferes with necessary choices represents cruelty to those whose lives depend upon our strength rather than our weakness." The philosophical justification transformed compassion into selfishness and practical necessity into highest virtue, creating logical framework that made continued argument impossible without challenging fundamental assumptions about pack survival and leadership authority. As Kieran's breathing grew more labored and his mother's efforts became increasingly desperate, Lyra found herself facing choice that would determine not just her own survival, but her capacity to live with decisions that would define who she truly was when circumstances stripped away comfortable illusions about moral complexity. The practical decision was obvious. Kieran would die within hours regardless of intervention. Resources spent on temporary comfort would be wasted when they could be used to strengthen others whose survival prospects justified investment. Challenging pack leadership would result in punishment that could include her own elimination from consideration for future support during crises that tested everyone's worthiness for continued existence. But watching 10-year-old cubs struggle for breath while adults who claimed to value life stood by because emotional attachment was deemed counterproductive created cognitive dissonance that challenged every assumption about what it meant to be strong, wise, or worthy of survival in a world that reduced such concepts to mathematical calculations about efficiency. Lyra stepped forward. The movement was small but unmistakable, separating her from other pack members who maintained safe distance from medical emergency that had been defined as beyond intervention. Her approach toward dying cub represented direct defiance of elders' instructions, an implicit challenge to pack priorities that had been established through generations of experience, with choices that survival demanded. "Lyra," came warning voice from behind her, though she didn't turn to identify speaker whose concern might be genuine or might represent attempt to prevent her from creating complications that would require additional administrative attention. "Don't do anything foolish." But foolishness and wisdom were matters of perspective, and Lyra's perspective was being shaped by crisis that revealed difference between survival that preserved life and survival that destroyed everything that made life worth preserving. She knelt beside Kieran with movements that emphasized gentle competence rather than dramatic gesture, her hands beginning assessment of his condition that would determine what intervention was possible rather than whether intervention was permitted according to pack protocol. "Lyra Ashen." Elder Gareth's voice carried warning that made pack members shift nervously as they recognized confrontation between individual conscience and collective necessity that would test boundaries between acceptable behavior and outright defiance. "Step away from the condemned. Your interference serves no purpose except prolonging suffering. Perhaps, Lyra replied without ceasing her examination of Kieran's breathing difficulties. But prolonging suffering seems preferable to abandoning hope while life remains. Hope for what? The cub will die regardless. Your sentiment changes nothing except wasting energy that could serve productive purposes. Then let me waste my own energy on choices that serve my own conscience, Elder Gareth. The cost is mine to bear. The exchange represented fundamental disagreement about individual versus collective responsibility, personal moral authority versus pack discipline, and the question of whether survival demanded abandonment of values that gave meaning to continued existence. The cost extends beyond individual choice, when defiance of necessary decisions encourages others to question leadership authority based on emotional attachment rather than practical wisdom. And what wisdom teaches us to abandon dying children because their survival is inconvenient for our resource management? The question hung in air like challenge that demanded answer from pack leadership, whose authority depended upon confidence that their decisions served collective interest rather than administrative convenience disguised as necessity. The wisdom that recognizes individual sentiment cannot be allowed to compromise collective survival, when difficult choices must be made by those responsible for protecting everyone, rather than indulging personal feelings that serve no practical purpose. Then let my personal feelings serve no practical purpose except defining who I choose to be when circumstances reveal what kind of strength really matters. As philosophical debate continued around Kieran's increasingly critical condition, Lyra began implementing medical intervention based on knowledge she had acquired through observation of pack healers, whose services were indeed limited and carefully rationed according to practical priorities that emphasized efficiency over comprehensive care. But her intervention revealed capabilities that surprised everyone present, including herself. Her hands seemed to know exactly what needed to be done, despite lacking formal training in medical techniques, while her understanding of Kieran's condition appeared more sophisticated than casual observation should have provided. The cub's breathing began to stabilize under her care with improvement that was dramatic enough to attract attention from pack members who had expected to witness continued deterioration rather than medical recovery that challenged assumptions about his prognosis and survival prospects. Interesting, Elder Gareth observed with tone that suggested Lyra's capabilities were generating questions about her background and training that hadn't been considered relevant until circumstances revealed knowledge that exceeded expectations about her competence. Where did you acquire medical skills that appear to exceed what pack education typically provides? Observation and necessity, Elder Gareth. When resources are limited, those with time and inclination learn to provide care that others cannot spare energy to deliver. And this care extends to preserving lives that pack leadership has determined cannot be sustained through resource allocation designed to serve collective survival. This care extends to preserving lives while they exist, regardless of administrative decisions about their future sustainability. The distinction created philosophical framework that separated immediate moral obligation from long-term practical planning, suggesting that short-term compassion might coexist with difficult resource decisions without necessarily compromising pack survival if managed appropriately. Very well, Elder Gareth said, after watching Kieran's continued improvement under Lyra's intervention. The cub will live through dawn, but resource allocation for his continued care remains subject to pack priorities that cannot be modified based on individual sentiment, regardless of temporary medical improvement. Understood, Elder. My intervention addresses immediate crisis rather than challenging long-term decision-making authority. The compromise allowed Lyra to continue providing care, while acknowledging that pack leadership retained ultimate authority over resource allocation and survival decisions that individual conscience could not override through emotional appeal. But as dawn approached with growing light that would reveal consequences of choices made during darkness hours when practical necessity competed with moral obligation, sounds reached the pack gathering that would transform individual crisis into collective confrontation with power that operated according to laws none of them fully understood. The thundering of hooves across frozen ground announced approaching riders, whose presence commanded immediate attention from pack leadership, responsible for managing territorial security against external threats that could materialize without warning during vulnerable moments when internal divisions created opportunities for enemies to exploit. But these riders bore standards that identified them as representatives of authority that transcended territorial boundaries and pack politics, carrying symbols that every wolf in the northern reaches learned to recognize during childhood education about powers that shaped their world through decisions made far from local concerns about survival and resource management. King Cale Blackthorn rode at the head of formation that represented personal power and political authority that made pack leadership appear insignificant by comparison, his presence commanding deference that reflected not just royal status, but personal capabilities that had unified territories through strength that could not be challenged through conventional resistance. Behind him came warriors whose reputation preceded them across battlefields where their intervention had determined outcomes of conflicts that affected thousands of lives through strategic decisions that individual courage alone could never influence. But their attention seemed focused on immediate circumstances rather than broader territorial concerns, suggesting that their arrival was connected to current situation rather than coincidental timing. "Alpha King," Elder Gareth said with respectful deference that transformed from administrative authority into diplomatic courtesy, as he recognized that pack autonomy was temporarily suspended through presence of supreme authority whose decisions could override local governance without appeal or negotiation. "Your arrival honors our territory, though we were not expecting royal attention to our humble concerns." "My attention," King Cale replied with voice that carried easily across the gathering despite being pitched conversationally rather than projected for public address, was drawn by reports of interesting developments that may warrant investigation rather than administrative oversight. "Your Majesty, what developments would justify royal interest in routine pack management decisions? Developments involving individual choices that reveal characteristics worthy of evaluation for purposes beyond local territorial concerns." The king's gaze moved systematically across the assembled pack members before settling with unmistakable focus on Lyra, who remained kneeling beside Kieran while maintaining her medical intervention, despite obvious awareness that her situation had become significantly more complicated through arrival of authority that could reshape her circumstances in ways that local pack politics could never influence. "You," King Cale said with tone that suggested recognition rather than casual identification, "are the individual whose choices have attracted attention that transcends local territorial boundaries." "Your Majesty," Lyra replied, with voice that remained steady despite obvious awareness that royal attention could transform her confrontation with pack leadership into crisis, with implications she couldn't predict or control. "I am Lyra Ashen, and my choices reflect personal conscience rather than political considerations. Personal conscience that prioritizes preservation of life over practical resource management decisions made by recognized pack leadership. Yes, Your Majesty, though I recognize that such priorities may represent naivety rather than wisdom about survival in circumstances that demand difficult choices. And you maintain such priorities despite understanding their potential cost to your own survival prospects within pack structure that depends upon collective decision-making rather than individual moral judgment. Yes, Your Majesty, though I hope wisdom might eventually reconcile compassion with practical necessity rather than requiring abandonment of either consideration." The philosophical exchange was conducted with formal courtesy that acknowledged royal authority, while maintaining positions that reflected fundamental disagreement about priorities that shaped individual behavior, when survival and conscience generated conflicting demands. "Interesting," King Cale observed with expression that suggested Lyra's responses were confirming expectations, rather than providing surprising information. "Elder Gareth, what assessment do you offer regarding this individual's suitability for continued membership in pack structure that emphasizes collective survival over personal sentiment?" "Your Majesty, her defiance of necessary decisions represents challenge to leadership authority that could encourage similar defiance from others whose emotional attachment might compromise practical decision-making during crisis situations. And yet her intervention appears to have been successful in preserving life that your leadership had determined was unsustainable through available resources. Temporarily successful, Your Majesty, though long-term sustainability remains questionable given resource limitations that cannot be modified through individual sentiment regardless of short-term medical improvement." "I see. So her success in preserving life represents problem rather than achievement, because it challenges assumptions about what is possible through individual effort, guided by personal conviction, rather than collective necessity." The royal analysis forced pack leadership to acknowledge that their objections to Lyra's intervention were based more on procedural concerns than practical results. revealing potential weakness in logical framework they use to justify decisions about survival and resource allocation. "Your Majesty," Elder Gareth said carefully, recognizing that royal questions were leading toward conclusions that might not align with pack preferences about maintaining authority over internal decision-making processes. "Our concerns focus on maintaining discipline necessary for collective survival, rather than questioning individual achievements that may not be sustainable over time." Understood. However, individual achievements that exceed collective expectations may warrant evaluation for purposes that transcend local territorial concerns about disciplinary maintenance. "What purposes, Your Majesty?" "Purposes related to recognition that exceptional individuals might serve broader territorial interests through capabilities that conventional pack structure cannot fully utilize or develop effectively." The implication that Lyra's capabilities might have value beyond local pack politics created new framework for evaluating her defiance that transformed challenging behavior into potential asset worthy of protection rather than punishment. But before Elder Gareth could respond to royal suggestion that individual worth might transcend pack authority over survival decisions, King Cale's attention returned to Lyra with intensity that suggested his evaluation was reaching conclusions that would reshape her circumstances regardless of local preferences about maintaining established power structures. "Lyra Ashen," he said with authority that transformed discussion into formal declaration, "your choices this night have revealed characteristics worthy of recognition beyond territorial boundaries that constrain pack membership. Such recognition carries obligations and opportunities that transcend local concerns about resource allocation and survival priorities. Your Majesty, I'm honored by royal attention, though I'm uncertain what obligations or opportunities such recognition would entail. Obligations and opportunities associated with accepting my claim upon your service and loyalty in roles that would serve territorial interests through capabilities you have demonstrated despite lacking formal authorization or training." The declaration sent shock through pack assembly as they processed implications of royal claim that would remove Lyra from local authority while elevating her to status that made pack politics irrelevant to her future prospects. "Your Majesty," she said, with voice that struggled to remain steady despite obvious awareness that her life was being transformed through decisions made by authority she could not refuse or negotiate with effectively. "I accept whatever service serves territorial interests, though I hope such service allows continued attention to individual conscience that guides personal choices. Such service will require individual conscience guided by wisdom that serves broader purposes than local territorial concerns, though personal convictions that led to this recognition will remain central to responsibilities you will assume." As royal authority began implementing changes that would transform Lyra from challenging pack member into someone whose status transcended local politics entirely, the pack that had dismissed her as weak confronted evidence that their understanding of power, authority, and value was far more limited than they had ever imagined. The girl they had laughed at for choosing sentiment over survival had been claimed by supreme authority whose own power was built upon recognition of qualities that conventional wisdom failed to identify or appreciate. The dawn would indeed reveal consequences of choices made during darkness, though those consequences would challenge every assumption about what strength meant when tested by circumstances that revealed character, through decisions that could not be calculated or predicted through conventional analysis. Chapter 2. The royal claim transformed everything in moments that felt suspended outside normal time, though the practical implications would require careful navigation through political complexities that neither Lyra nor the Ashwood Pack had prepared for through conventional experience with authority that transcended territorial boundaries. King Cale's declaration carried weight that made pack leadership's concerns about resource allocation and disciplinary maintenance seem insignificant by comparison, though Elder Gareth's expression suggested he was processing implications that extended beyond simple loss of challenging pack member to potential consequences for maintaining local autonomy in face of royal interest in their internal affairs. "Your Majesty," Elder Gareth said with careful diplomacy that acknowledged supreme authority while attempting to preserve some measure of local decision-making prerogative, "we are honored by royal recognition of individual merit, though we hope such recognition does not reflect dissatisfaction with pack management practices that have served territorial stability effectively." "Pack management practices are adequate for routine territorial administration," King Cale replied, with tone that suggested distinction between competent local governance and exceptional circumstances that required different approaches. "However, exceptional individuals may require recognition that conventional administrative frameworks cannot provide appropriately. Understood, Your Majesty. How should the pack adjust existing frameworks to accommodate royal interests while maintaining effective local governance? No adjustment necessary. The individual will be removed from local authority entirely and integrated into royal service where her capabilities can be developed without constraints imposed by resource limitations or conventional expectations about appropriate behavior. The finality of royal decision eliminated pack authority over Lyra's circumstances while providing framework that preserved local autonomy for routine matters that didn't involve individuals whose qualities attracted royal attention through actions that revealed exceptional character. But implementation of royal claim would require practical arrangements that addressed immediate concerns while establishing precedent for how supreme authority interacted with local governance when circumstances demanded intervention rather than simple administrative oversight. Lyra Ashen, King Kale said with attention, that remained focused on her responses, despite obvious awareness that pack leadership was struggling to process implications of developments they couldn't influence through conventional political means. Your transition to royal service begins immediately. Gather whatever personal possessions represent significant value and prepare for departure within the hour. Your Majesty, what about Kieran? His condition remains critical despite improvement under my intervention. The cub will be transported with royal medical support that can address his needs more comprehensively than local resources permit. His survival will no longer depend upon pack resource allocation decisions. The royal solution addressed Lyra's immediate concern while demonstrating that supreme authority possessed capabilities for resolving problems that had seemed intractable through conventional means, transforming individual crisis into opportunity for comprehensive assistance that exceeded what local governance could provide. Furthermore, King Kale continued with tone that suggested additional considerations were being addressed through systematic approach to managing complex transition. His family will receive compensation that acknowledges their sacrifice in supporting individual who demonstrated exceptional character under circumstances that tested personal conviction against practical necessity. Your Majesty, Kieran's mother said with voice that carried overwhelming relief at unexpected resolution to crisis that had seemed certain to end tragically, regardless of individual intervention. Such generosity exceeds anything we could have hoped for given circumstances that seemed beyond remedy. Circumstances that seemed beyond remedy often require recognition that conventional approaches may be inadequate for addressing problems that demand innovative solutions based on exceptional individual capability rather than administrative efficiency. The philosophical framework emphasized that individual merit could transcend systemic limitations when properly recognized and supported through authority that possessed resources unavailable to local governance structures designed for routine administration rather than crisis resolution. As royal authority continued implementing systematic approach to managing Lyra's transition, while addressing associated concerns about individual welfare and pack stability, movement among the assembled pack members suggested that broader implications were being processed through discussions that reflected mixture of surprise, concern, and grudging recognition that royal intervention had resolved crisis in ways that local decision-making could never have achieved. Your Majesty, Lyra said, during brief pause in administrative arrangements that were transforming her circumstances through decisions that emphasized comprehensive support rather than minimal resource allocation. I'm grateful for royal recognition and assistance, though I hope my service justifies confidence being placed in capabilities I'm still discovering myself. Capabilities that exceeded expectations during circumstances that tested character more thoroughly than formal evaluation could provide. Royal service will develop those capabilities through challenges that serve broader territorial interests, while honoring personal convictions that led to this recognition. And what specific form will such service take, Your Majesty? Service that begins with education regarding royal responsibilities and territorial governance, followed by gradual integration into decision-making processes that require individual judgment guided by wisdom rather than conventional administrative protocols. The description suggested comprehensive preparation for roles that would utilize Lyra's demonstrated capabilities, while providing foundation for continued development through exposure to challenges that exceeded anything local pack politics could offer. But before detailed discussion of future responsibilities could continue, approaching dawn began revealing additional complexities that would influence how royal claim was implemented through practical arrangements that addressed not just individual transition, but broader territorial implications of supreme authority intervention in local governance decisions. Scout reports indicated that neighboring packs had been monitoring Ashwood territory with attention that suggested awareness of internal tensions and potential opportunities for territorial advantage if local stability was compromised through leadership challenges or resource allocation disputes that created vulnerabilities for external exploitation. Captain Thorne, King Cale commanded with authority, that transformed individual crisis into broader security operation, designed to address multiple concerns through coordinated action, established defensive perimeter that ensures transition proceeds without interference from external threats that might exploit temporary disruption of local territorial security. Understood, Your Majesty. How should neighboring pack surveillance be addressed? Standard diplomatic notification that royal presence in territory represents routine administrative consultation, rather than crisis intervention, that might suggest vulnerability requiring defensive response from potential territorial competitors. The security measures acknowledged that individual transition carried implications for broader territorial stability, while providing framework for managing those implications through established diplomatic protocols, rather than allowing speculation to create unnecessary complications. Elder Gareth, King Cale continued with attention, that returned to local governance concerns that would persist after royal departure. What arrangements will ensure continued pack stability after removal of individual whose presence had created administrative challenges requiring resolution? Your Majesty, removal of challenging influence will allow return to conventional decision-making processes without complications introduced by individual sentiment that interfered with practical resource allocation. And lessons learned from this experience regarding recognition of exceptional individuals before circumstances create administrative challenges that require external intervention. The question carried implications about future prevention of situations where individual merit conflicted with local governance capabilities, suggesting that effective territorial administration required systems for identifying and developing exceptional capabilities, rather than simply managing them through conventional disciplinary measures. Your Majesty, we will implement evaluation processes that identify exceptional individuals for specialized development that serves both local and territorial interests before personal convictions create conflicts with resource allocation necessities. Excellent. Such processes serve everyone's interest through early identification of capabilities that conventional frameworks might not utilize effectively. As administrative arrangements continued addressing immediate transition requirements while establishing precedent for future management of similar circumstances, Lyra found herself observing transformation of crisis that had seemed certain to result in her exile into opportunity that would reshape her entire understanding of what was possible when individual capability was supported through aid, resources, and appropriate authority. The cub she had chosen to save despite personal cost would not only survive, but would receive care that exceeded anything local resources could have provided, while her own demonstration of character had attracted recognition that would provide opportunities for service that honored, rather than suppressed personal convictions about protecting those who needed protection. The pack that had laughed at her choice would be forced to reconsider their assumptions about strength, wisdom, and the distribution of power within territorial structure that included levels of authority they had never fully understood, despite living within systems that such authority had created and maintained through decisions made far beyond their local concerns. Within the hour, Lyra would begin journey toward future that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her own capabilities and the responsibilities that came with recognition from supreme authority, whose own power was built upon understanding that exceptional individuals required exceptional opportunities to serve purposes that transcended conventional expectations about what was past. Sybil through personal commitment guided by conscience rather than calculation. The journey to the royal stronghold revealed landscapes that existed beyond Lyra's previous understanding of what their territory contained. Vast expanses of managed wilderness and fortified settlements that spoke of organizational capabilities she had never imagined, despite living within systems that such capabilities had created and sustained through generations of careful governance and strategy. GC planning. King Cale rode beside her with presence that seemed both protective and evaluative, his attention divided between ensuring her comfort during transition, that represented complete transformation of her circumstances, and observing her responses to evidence of power and authority that operated according to principles she would need to understand if royal service was to succeed rather than overwhelm her through complexity beyond her current preparation. The stronghold ahead houses administrative centers that coordinate territorial governance across regions that include dozens of pack territories, he explained as they crested ridge that provided panoramic view of structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with natural landscape, while clearly representing human engineering on scale that individual communities could never attempt. Your education will begin with understanding how such coordination serves local interests through resources and capabilities that isolated governance cannot provide. Your Majesty, the scope seems almost impossible to comprehend from perspective of pack-level administration, focused on immediate survival and resource allocation. Understandable reaction, though perspective will expand through exposure to challenges that require coordination across multiple territories to address threats and opportunities that individual communities cannot handle independently. The explanation emphasized that her transition involved not just personal elevation, but integration into systems that operated according to principles that transcended everything she had been taught about governance, authority, and the practical limitations that shaped decision-making at levels she had previously understood. As they approached the stronghold's outer defenses, Lyra began to appreciate the systematic precision that characterized every aspect of royal administration. Guard rotations moved with clockwork efficiency, supply caravans followed precisely coordinated schedules, and communication networks maintained constant information flow between central authority and territorial administrators, whose responsibilities included managing local concerns while supporting broader strategic objectives. "Captain Thorne," King Kale called to his second-in-command, as they passed through checkpoint that verified authorization with procedures that balanced security requirements against operational efficiency. A range orientation briefing that provides foundational understanding of administrative structure and territorial coordination principles. Standard introduction for individuals entering royal service from local governance background. Understood, Your Majesty. Should the briefing emphasize specific areas of responsibility that relate to demonstrated capabilities, or should it provide comprehensive overview that allows identification of optimal service assignments? And comprehensive overview initially, followed by specialized focus based on aptitude assessment and personal preferences regarding how individual capabilities can best serve territorial interests. The administrative precision suggested that royal service included systematic approaches to education and development that would utilize individual strengths while providing foundation for understanding broader responsibilities that such service entailed. But Lyra's attention was suddenly captured by commotion near the stronghold's medical facilities, where activity levels suggested crisis requiring immediate attention from personnel whose expertise exceeded routine healthcare provision. Through conversations she could overhear, the emergency involved multiple casualties from territorial dispute that had escalated beyond local resolution capabilities. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, recognizing that her impulse to offer assistance might not be appropriate, given her lack of formal medical training and uncertain status within royal administrative structure. Would medical assistance be welcome from someone with limited but relevant experience? King Kale studied her expression with intensity that suggested he was evaluating not just her offer, but the motivations that prompted willingness to engage immediately with emergency, that represented exactly the type of challenge that royal service would involve regularly. Medical assistance would indeed be welcome, though such assistance would require integration with established protocols and supervision by qualified personnel responsible for ensuring that emergency response maintains standards necessary for optimal patient outcomes. "Of course, Your Majesty. I would serve under whatever supervision ensures effective coordination, rather than independent action that might compromise established procedures. Captain Thorne, arrange integration with medical response team that can utilize additional capable hands while providing appropriate supervision and evaluation of performance under emergency conditions." The arrangement provided immediate opportunity for Lyra to contribute useful service, while allowing assessment of her capabilities under circumstances that would reveal much about her suitability for responsibilities that royal service might eventually include. As they approached medical facility where emergency response was coordinating treatment for casualties, whose conditions required immediate attention, Lyra found herself observing administrative efficiency that exceeded anything she had witnessed at pack level, despite having considered their local governance adequate for addressing routine healthcare needs. Multiple teams worked with coordinated precision that suggested extensive training in emergency protocols, while supply systems provided equipment and medications that represented resources far beyond what individual communities could maintain independently. Most impressive was communication network that allowed real-time consultation with specialists whose expertise might be located anywhere within territorial system. Dr. Aldrich, Kincaid said as they reached senior medical officer, whose responsibilities included coordinating response to complex emergencies that tested capabilities of even royal medical establishment. Additional assistance available from individual with demonstrated medical intuition and proven commitment to patient welfare, regardless of resource considerations. Your Majesty, assistance would be valuable given casualty volume that exceeds our immediate staffing capacity. What level of medical training has this individual received? Practical experience rather than formal training, though experience includes successful intervention in critical situations where conventional protocols might have been insufficient for achieving optimal outcomes. Understood. I'll assign supervision that can evaluate capabilities while ensuring patient safety and coordinated response effectiveness. The professional integration proceeded with systematic precision that emphasized both safety and opportunity, providing framework for useful service while protecting against complications that might arise from inexperience with formal medical protocols. As Lyra began working under supervision that balanced trust with appropriate caution, her capabilities became apparent through performance that exceeded expectations despite her lack of formal training. Her intuitive understanding of patient needs combined with precise manual skills created effectiveness that suggested natural aptitude for medical service, enhanced by experience that had developed practical competence despite limited educational opportunities. Interesting, Dr. Aldrich observed after watching her successfully stabilize patient whose condition had been deteriorating despite conventional treatment approaches. Her techniques include elements that suggest exposure to advanced medical methods not typically available at PAC level. How advanced? Kincaid asked, with tone that suggested Lyra's capabilities continued revealing aspects of her background that warranted investigation beyond routine personnel evaluation. Techniques consistent with specialized emergency medicine that requires extensive training and exceptional aptitude. Either her practical experience was more comprehensive than indicated, or she possesses intuitive medical understanding that exceeds normal human capability. And your assessment regarding which explanation seems more likely? Given performance consistency across multiple patient presentations, intuitive capability seems more probable than extensive hidden training. Such capability would represent exceptional natural talent, worthy of systematic development through formal medical education. The evaluation suggested that Lyra's demonstration of character through choosing to save dying cub had revealed not just moral courage, but practical capabilities that might have significance beyond what anyone had initially recognized. But before detailed analysis of her medical performance could continue, new developments demanded attention from royal authority responsible for coordinating response to crisis that was expanding beyond initial casualty treatment to broader territorial implications that required administrative rather than purely medical intervention. Your Majesty, came report from Territorial Administrator, whose responsibilities included monitoring regional stability and coordinating response to events that might affect multiple communities. The incident that produced these casualties represents escalation of territorial dispute that requires diplomatic intervention to prevent further violence. Assessment of escalation potential if diplomatic intervention is delayed? Significant, Your Majesty. Multiple PACs are involved, resource disputes are intensifying, and traditional conflict resolution mechanisms have proven inadequate for addressing underlying tensions. Captain Thorne, prepare diplomatic mission that addresses root causes rather than simply managing immediate symptoms. Include personnel capable of understanding local concerns while representing royal authority effectively. As royal administration began coordinating systematic response to crisis that exceeded local governance capabilities, Lyra found herself observing decision-making processes that balanced immediate emergency management with longer-term strategic planning designed to prevent recurrence rather than simply addressing current manifestations. The integration of medical response, diplomatic intervention, and administrative coordination demonstrated capabilities that individual communities could never develop independently, while the systematic approach to problem-solving suggested that royal service involved comprehensive rather than narrow specialization. Dr. Aldrich, Kincaid said during brief pause in administrative coordination that allowed attention to return to individual personnel evaluation. What recommendation do you offer regarding formal medical training for individual whose capabilities warrant development despite unconventional background? Immediate enrollment in accelerated medical program that recognizes existing competence while providing theoretical foundation and formal certification necessary for independent practice. Her natural abilities, combined with systematic education, would produce exceptional medical officer capable of serving territorial healthcare needs. And timeline for such education? 18 months for basic certification, additional year for specialization in emergency medicine that matches her demonstrated aptitude. Arrange enrollment that begins immediately. Medical capabilities of demonstrated quality serve territorial interests through improved healthcare provision, while honoring individual strengths that should be developed rather than wasted through conventional assignment to routine administrative duties. The decision reflected royal commitment to utilizing individual capabilities optimally, while providing opportunities for advancement that served both personal development and broader territorial needs. As administrative arrangements continued establishing framework for Lyra's integration into royal service through education that would develop natural abilities while providing systematic understanding of territorial governance and specialized responsibilities, she found herself confronting questions about her own identity and capabilities that she had never considered during life focused on survey. All within pack structure that had never challenged her to discover what she might be capable of achieving under different circumstances. The girl who had chosen conscience over calculation, despite social pressure to prioritize survival over sentiment, was discovering that such choices attracted recognition from authority that possessed resources for developing exceptional individuals through opportunities unavailable within conventional local governance frameworks. The cub she had saved would indeed survive and thrive under royal medical care that exceeded anything pack resources could have provided, while her own demonstration of character had revealed capabilities that would be systematically developed through education and training, designed to produce individuals capable of serving territorial interests through expertise that combined natural ability with each formal preparation. 2 years later, the royal court had assembled for ceremony that would formalize changes in territorial governance structure designed to improve coordination between central authority and local administration, while recognizing exceptional individuals whose capabilities had been developed through royal service into expertise that served broader territorial interests. Lyra stood before King Kale with confidence that reflected comprehensive education in medical practice, territorial administration, and diplomatic protocols that had transformed intuitive capabilities into systematic expertise worthy of formal recognition through positions that would utilize her abilities, while honoring personal convictions that had first attracted royal attention. Dr. Lyra Ashen, King Kale announced with authority that carried across assembled court, whose composition included representatives from throughout territorial system. Your service has demonstrated that individual conscience guided by wisdom can serve territorial interests through innovative approaches that conventional frameworks might not have identified or developed effectively. Your Majesty, royal service has provided opportunities to develop capabilities in ways that serve both personal fulfillment and broader territorial needs through challenges that conventional pack life could never have offered. Indeed, and such service warrants recognition through formal appointment to position that acknowledges expertise while providing authority necessary for implementing innovative approaches to persistent challenges that affect territorial welfare. What position would serve territorial interests while utilizing demonstrated capabilities appropriately, Your Majesty? Royal consort responsible for coordinating healthcare and welfare policies that protect individual welfare while maintaining territorial stability through systematic attention to both practical necessity and moral obligation. The announcement sent ripples through assembled court as representatives processed implications of appointment that would formalize partnership between supreme authority and individual whose elevation had begun with choice to prioritize conscience over conventional calculation. Your Majesty, Lyra replied, with voice that balanced professional competence with personal emotion that reflected recognition of honor being offered. I accept such appointment with understanding that service requires balancing individual conscience with wisdom that serves territorial interests through decisions that protect both immediate welfare and long-term stability. Understanding that represents exactly the quality of judgment necessary for position that requires innovation, guided by principle, rather than adherence to conventional approaches that may be inadequate for addressing complex challenges. A ceremony continued formalizing appointment that would reshape territorial governance through integration of individual conscience with systematic administration. Representatives observed transformation that challenged traditional assumptions about relationship between personal conviction and effective leadership. The Omega, who had been dismissed as weak for choosing sentiment over survival, had become royal consort, whose expertise would influence policy affecting thousands of lives through approaches that balanced compassion with practical necessity in ways that served both individual welfare and collective security. The cub she had saved had grown into a healthy young wolf, whose survival demonstrated that apparent weakness might mask strength, requiring appropriate recognition and support rather than elimination through administrative efficiency that failed to account for potential that could be developed under favorable circumstances. The pack that had laughed at her defiance had witnessed elevation that forced reconsideration of their assumptions about strength, wisdom, and the mysterious forces that shaped advancement through recognition that conventional hierarchies might miss exceptional individuals whose worth became apparent only under circumstances that tested character rather than conformity. King Kale's claim upon her service had indeed transformed weakness into strength, though the transformation had revealed that apparent weakness had never represented actual limitation, but rather potential that required appropriate recognition and development through opportunities that conventional frameworks could not provide. The crown that would rest upon her head reflected not just personal advancement, but institutional change that acknowledged individual conscience as essential component of effective governance when guided by wisdom that served territorial interests through policies that protected both practical necessity and moral obligation. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.